were talking and smiling, even a little laughter. And then as they were sitting there and it was over, they stood up, other jurors were talking amongst each other. Now that can change when deliberations begin, because I've seen this many, many times in this process they're going to do because of, I guess, COVID, and also just not having people need to come to the governmental center by Zoom, the questions of the jury by Zoom. You know what's good about coming into the courtroom to hear the question and the jury comes in the courtroom, you hear the answer, you can read the jury. I mean, you don't know what's happening, but you can look at their expressions. And I've seen demeanors of anger and demeanors of being so tired and demeanors of bonding with certain jurors, and we're not going to see all that. That will be lost with these Zoom questions. So we literally will not be able to gauge at all, not that we ever do, because it's tea leaves, right? But we can't gauge how the jury is even feeling demeanor-wise during this process.
Got it. And to clarify, so these questions, well, we know the questions. We normally do, Gene, right? Everyone convenes, we know the questions. Okay.
No, but we won't be hearing it unless there is some way that the television feed allows for us to see the attorneys at their computers and the judge at his computer and maybe even the defendant, and not the jury. I mean, I'm sure that they're trying to do that.
Yeah, again,
at least the media.
In a lot of ways, it's the case unlike any other in so many ways. I'm sure we'll get more clarity as we head toward closing arguments on Monday. Darren Porcher, you've been with us every step of the way. All evidence submitted. The state of Minnesota rests. Your thoughts?
I mean, I think that this is a slam dunk for the prosecution. In no way, shape, or form does the defense have any credence in terms of turning this from a guilty plea. But one thing I want to go back to what happened earlier. When we look at the demeanor of former Officer Chauvin in court, it was kind of surprising to me when he spoke to him not testifying. He seemed as if he had a somewhat of an appearance of calm, so to speak. He even smiled. And from the way I look at it, I would think that he should be in a very disastrous state, knowing that he wasn't willing to testify based on the mountain of evidence that's going to be posed against him. So that was somewhat telling to me in terms of how we're moving forward. But next week, it's just going to be interesting to see how long the deliberation takes in terms of how Gene mentioned how the jurors are able to connect based on different aspects of this case. And that's something that remains to be seen. But I'm giving you my prediction, and I see this is going guilty all the way down the line, because in no way, shape, or form do I see anything that former Officer Chauvin had that he can attach to introduce what he did was credible, and that was the knee on the neck for 9+ minutes.
You got to appreciate Darren. He will make a bold prediction. Wrong on Derek Chauvin testifying, but saying slam dunk there. Do you, Joseph Scott Morgan, you agree? Prosecution, very strong case heading into closing arguments?
Well, first off, I agree. Darren makes those bold predictions, man. But yeah, this is kind of my takeaway from a scientific standpoint. It gives me pause to think what these jury members are faced with. This is, out of all the cases that you and I have covered together over the years, Mike, and where I've commented on other things, I don't necessarily recall anything that is quite this scientifically intricate. And so when they go back into that room and begin to deliberate, being able to pick through a lot of this testimony that's highly technical and contextualize it, so that they understand, kind of the time frame, the timeline, how all this lays out, the physiological responses that they were faced with, even stuff about basic chemistry, I think is kind of shocking for someone that's not used to swimming in these waters. And keep in mind that these folks they're common, everyday people, which is great. That's what we're made up of here in America. But they've been called to do a sacred duty here. And so they're faced with a Herculean task, I think, trying to understand this. And to Jean's point that she's made a couple of times, one key person in this jury is going to be that nurse. And the dynamic there, and will they look to her to explain things? And I think that's kind of outside of what you're supposed to do. But, you really wonder, is she going to take a leadership role on the jury?
All right. Well, again,
Kalemnik is an agent of the GRU, the Russian military. The GRU is the hacking outfit that went after Hillary Clinton. You know, many of her emails, the DCCC, many of these targets were from GRU hackers. Separately, there's a guy named Prigozhin. Prigozhin was the guy who ran the Internet Research Agency, better known as the Russian troll farm. They were doing very targeted social media operations. And what would they need? Well, it would be great to know two things. One, what is the Trump campaign strategy? Two, where would they refine their targeting at? And then there's really a third one, which is how far do we want to go with the Trump campaign? So if you know that data, if you know both the Trump campaign strategy and what the polling data is saying, and you're Vladimir Putin, you can start to make calculations about how much you want to interfere in the election and where would you interfere in the election? Where would you pull those levers going into election day? So that's a very powerful loop. It's three parts. It's hacking, it's influence on social media, and now we know about actual agents who are doing inside the Trump campaign, having connections in terms of what that strategy is. That is the triad of a perfect influence and interference campaign going into election 2016. And I would note, Nicole, that Konstantin Kilimnik, he is still on Twitter. I guarantee you, he's probably watching the segment right now. And he has been spotted several times, tweeting about what's going on with U.S. election 2020. Many of the people sanctioned today, Prigozhin, his network, it extends into Africa. One of the people sanctioned, Malkovich. Malkovich was sanctioned in 2018 for the midterm election. He's now sanctioned again. So this system continued to perpetuate because we just didn't do anything during those middle years between 2016 and 2020. We had very limited actions because President Trump was the president, and that was always the barrier to really going full circle like we did today.
Well, you just hinted at where I want to go with you, Andrew Weissman. I mean, do you think that this intelligence about Kilimnik's conduct after he received the targeting and campaign information from Manafort, what he did with it, was known to U.S. intelligence? I mean, what information or intelligence did the U.S. Treasury Department have when they wrote what was released in today's sanction that you did not have as a Mueller team investigator?
Well, the one thing that is clear, as you've reported, Nicole, is we did not have the piece that is what Kilimnik did with the polling data that we now know from the release today actually went, as Clint said, directly to Russian intelligence. The interesting question that I don't know the answer to is, was that information known to the intelligence community at the time of the Mueller investigation? You know, my sort of educated speculation on that would be it would seem like it would have to have been known because the Biden administration has only been operational for, I'm in New York, so I'll say a New York minute. So it seems unlikely that they really went ahead with that deep an investigation and got the information that quickly. So the question is sort of why didn't it get to the special counsel investigation? And, you know, I spearheaded the Manafort part of that investigation. I can tell you it certainly would have been a great interest, and we tried to turn over every rock that we could to prove up this link. And I would just say a good analogy of this is Watergate. You know, in Watergate, you know, you had the Republicans breaking into the Democratic Party because you want to know what your opponent's doing. Well, now we have the complete link of we have Russia knowing exactly what the Trump campaign polling information was and what they were seeing as strengths and weaknesses of their own and of Hillary Clinton. So they could use that to, as Clinton said, target what they were doing in both the hack and dump and also the influence campaign in terms of what states were vulnerable or not. One final piece is it's important to note that this is in the Mueller report, which is that Paul Manafort was conveying to Kilimnik what they were seeing in terms of which states were swing states, including places like Wisconsin. And that's something that was not generally well known. And so now we know that Kilimnik was relaying all of that information back to the GRU in Russia.
Miserable all the time. It's like the best thing in the world.
Miss Stabenow, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no.
Virginia seek recognition.
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Moore pursuant to Trust 8, I inform the House Ms. Moore will vote no on the Miller meeting.
Are expected to start on Monday morning, putting Chauvin's fate in the hands of a jury of his peers, which means we could theoretically be just days away from a verdict in this crucial trial, as CNN's Sarah Seidner now reports.
I will invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege today.
For the first time since the start of the trial, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin spoke in court.
Do you feel that your decision not to testify is a voluntary one on your behalf?
Yes, it is.
He chose not to take the stand as a witness in his own defense, leading the defense to rest its case.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense rests.
The prosecution then brought back its star medical witness to refute the idea brought up by yesterday's defense expert.
It is an extremely toxic gas.
That exhaust from the squad car's tailpipe possibly led to carbon monoxide poisoning of George Floyd.
Do you agree with that proposition that's highlighted there?
No, I do not. It's simply wrong.
The prosecution also attempted to introduce new lab result evidence about carbon monoxide poisoning.
It was discovered yesterday by Dr. Baker. It would return a value for the carbon monoxide content and then would show whether or not that result is in the normal range or not.
The defense argued the late evidence entry by the prosecution should lead to a mistrial.
It's our position that these new test results should not go in front of the jury, first and foremost. And second, if they were, I would be moving for a mistrial.
The judge agreed.
I find that the Dr. Fowler's report gave sufficient notice to the state that carbon monoxide that potentially was in George Floyd's blood could have affected cause of death. The late disclosure has prejudiced the defense. It's not going to be allowed.
A short time later, all witness testimony came to an end.
The state of Minnesota rests.
So, the defense and the prosecution have both rested, as you heard there, which means the jury will hear closing arguments on Monday, the judge says, and they could very well get the case on Monday as well and start deliberating. Now, I do want to mention this. Just a few minutes ago, about 5 minutes ago, I spoke with Philonis Floyd, who talked about what it was like being inside of the court and watching much of this trial. He said it was extremely difficult, extremely emotional, and he believes that all the evidence anyone needed to see in this case is the video that the world saw. And he said he's hoping the jury, in his words, gives the family justice. Jake?
All right, Sarah Seidner, thank you so much. Let's discuss with our panel. Jennifer, let me start with you. The defense rested today. They called 7 witnesses over 2 days. They only have to sway one juror, only have to convince that one person on the jury that there's reasonable doubt to have a hung jury. Do you think that the defense might have succeeded in achieving that?
I don't think so, Jake. You know, their goal, of course, was to throw a bunch of arguments out there and hope that something resonated with the jurors. But, you know, I just think it's too much to overcome with that video. You know, their witnesses, I think, were not as strong as the prosecution's. The cross-examination by the prosecutors was very, very effective. And so while they only need one, jurors tend to be collegial. They tend to collaborate. And when they get back in their jury room, they often sometimes compromise. So hung juries aren't as common as some people think. And I think this jury likely will be able to reach a verdict here.
Van, what do you think?
Well, I certainly hope so. You know, I don't think we should forget how hard it is for some people to accept that someone with a badge, someone with a uniform, someone who's been entrusted by society to enforce the law could just really be a despicable, horrible human being, which is obviously what we're looking at. We've seen no remorse from this officer. We saw no emotion from this officer. The idea that a sociopath could be walking around with a gun and a badge in our society, for some people it's just too much, and they will look for ways to reaffirm their own view that all police officers are all saints and superheroes. The question is, when they were in the jury selection process, how effective was the prosecution in weeding out people who think that way? If they were effective at getting those kind of extreme people out, they should be fine. But all you need is one to slip through and you got a problem.
Jennifer, explain to us what happened today with this carbon monoxide argument. The defense, Chauvin's team, had presented an argument from a medical expert that there are a number of factors that could have led to George Floyd's death, including the exhaust coming from the car. Then there was some sort of debate and discussion today. Explain what happened.
So apparently what happened is Dr. Baker, when he saw that testimony from the defense's expert, realized that there was a report about the levels of carbon monoxide in George Floyd's blood that was not turned over. And ultimately that means that it can't be used. It's too prejudicial to the defense to turn over expert reports late in trial. I mean, indeed, after the defense's expert had already testified about that topic. So that was excluded. Prosecutors were effective in their cross-examination on this topic of the defense's doctor, and they also were able to recall Dr. Tobin, who kind of got around it by using different information that actually was in front of the jury, so I don't think it hurt them, but it's an own goal. You should never have a report that just slips through the cracks and doesn't get turned over to the defense, because you could wind up in a mistrial situation, so that was unfortunate.
And an own goal by the prosecution?
Yes, that should never have happened. They should have been able to use that report for much more than they did. It would have totally eviscerated this argument about carbon monoxide had they been able to just have it come out during Dr. Tobin's testimony in the first place.
Van, the jury's going to be sequestered during deliberations. The judge said, pack for a long stay, hope for a short stay. Do you think we're going to get a quick verdict? What do you think?
The longer it waits, the worse it is for the family, the worse it is for the community, and the worse it is for justice. This should be open and shut. I agree that prosecution did make a mistake with this in this one area, but I'm somebody, as you know, I've spent 25 years, coordinating litigation and suing police officers, police departments, trying to close prisons, etc. I have never seen a prosecution team go after a cop like this. They did a great job. Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, needs to be commended for making sure they did a great job. And it should be open and shut. If they start haggling and haggling and haggling and haggling, what you could wind up with is some compromise thing, where you convict them on something small, then the sentencing is 12 months or 6 months, and then you're going to have a very bad outcome. So the longer it waits, it goes, the worse it is.
And Jennifer, the jury cannot ask to hear any more testimony. They can ask the judge questions. They'll have access to all of the evidence that's already been presented. So now the question will be, which testimony, which witnesses stuck with them the most?
Yeah, and it's really hard to tell. Apparently, and judges differ on their rules on this, he's going to send back all of the evidence for them to peruse, at their own leisure. So we won't even know what they're looking at. Oftentimes, and this is how it works in federal court, they'll actually ask a question, they'll ask to see testimony again, to have it read back to them, and so everyone will know kind of what they're focusing on. We won't know that here, but they'll have access to all of that. They can ask legal questions. There certainly will be plenty for them to mull over on these 3 different charges they have to consider.
All right, Jennifer, Van, thanks to both of you. Really appreciate it. We're standing by for President Biden to speak from the White House at any moment. But first, tense moments in a House hearing today with Dr. Anthony Fauci caught in the middle.
I don't want you to answer my question. The American people want Dr. Fauci to answer the question. What does it have to be?
Sir. You need to respect the chair and shut your mouth.
Down.
The pressing pandemic questions that led to that exchange, that's next.
Bill May knew that she wasn't done.
Later, his cries for help. I just think that George Floyd was in that courtroom throughout this whole trial.
Wow, I'm just going to read here. These are some of the cool notes. Gene has done a great job keeping us abreast of things, but this is the reaction from Arthur Reed. This is George Floyd's cousin in court today. And number one, talking about whether or not Derek Chauvin was going to testify. He said that they did not expect him to, that it would destroy their case. And this leads to really the gravity of it. He believes that the state has presented a strong case, but this family is ready for this to be over with. Again, Gene, how hard it must be for the Floyd family to see George Floyd alive in the Cup Foods. Yeah. And then to your point, what he went through before the end of his life. And Darren Porcher, to that point, and I believe that the prosecution has to play the video from the arrest to the time the ambulance takes him away, because George Floyd, I never see him as a threat. Does he not want to get in the squad car? Yes. But he's near tears at times. He's never threatening to officers. Correct. Do you ever see him as a threat, Darren?
I never saw George Floyd as a threat. And when we look at the alternatives, when he first came in contact with George Floyd and he was handcuffed, He was compliant. You notice as we're looking at this video, they have him seated by a wall, and he was somewhat, he was loquacious. The officers were engaging him in dialogue. It wasn't a problem. It came to the fruition when they tried to place him in the vehicle, when he stated that he was claustrophobic, he couldn't breathe. That's fine. Remember the start of the encounter. He was calm. That's why I would have revisited that and placed him back on that same wall and try to re-engage him in conversation. Police departments have additional vehicles that they can transport prisoners in. They have something we refer to as a prisoner van, which has a larger passenger compartment. That's what could have been introduced into the equation. However, the officers were steadfast on placing him on the ground, and that's when the level of force escalated. Once George Floyd was laid out on the ground, there was no need to continue the level of force that was being introduced. We speak to the prone position. We've heard from several experts that he should have been placed on his side in that rescue position. It didn't happen. In addition to that, the failure to introduce medical aid. So when you look at the culmination of all aspects of this, it was an excessive amount of force that could have been avoided, and that's why we're here today as a result.
I've said it again, as Gene, you put it, we're in the role of that 13th juror almost, that one of the most damning pieces of evidence is that you've watched this go, and it's like you've seen a movie and you want it to end differently, but you know it's not. And that's the moment that Darren's talking about. They can't find a pulse. You're like, help him, help him. This is an urgent situation. He needs care, help him. And they don't. And Misty, how's the defense? Will they even address that in closings?
Look, they have to, and they're going to use the angry crowd theory, Mike, that we've heard throughout this entire case. Oh, there's so much going on. There's traffic. There's the crowd. The crowd is building. Look at it. They're becoming more aggressive. They're going to point to some of that language that Eric Nelson has made sure he elicits on every cross-examination. And again, it's not just limited to what the crowd was at that time, because we've seen it, and I think we've all discussed it. A 9-year-old, some teenagers, a 61-year-old man. It's also going to be this idea that a crowd can change at any moment, and we've heard that a crowd can become something that is a big problem on a dime. So that's where the defense is going to go, the angry crowd defense. I must say, I think yesterday's testimony with respect to why Derek Chauvin didn't do EMS from the defendant's own expert, not good for the defense. But that's where they're going to go. It's going to be angry crowd theory all the way to explain away that situation.
No, Dr. Fowler even on the stand said he was critical of the officers not giving medical aid. Huge moment there for the prosecution. All right, when we come back, we'll talk more about closing arguments that are coming up on Monday. That could decide guilty or not guilty. We'll talk about it. You're watching HLN and our continuing coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial.
Losing a tooth didn't stop you, but your partial can act like a bacteria magnet, putting natural teeth at risk. New Polydent Pro Partial helps purify your partial and protects natural teeth. So, are you going to lose an...
See a little more sunshine this time for all of us. Here's the 10-day forecast now. In Sioux Falls, temperatures will be in the upper 40s tomorrow, 50 Saturday, and we're back to 60 on Sunday. Beautiful day. And then a cold front comes in on Monday, so it'll bring us a rain-snow mix on Monday, and that'll knock our temperatures down by about 15 degrees. Aberdeen, upper 40s for you tomorrow.
Score, but it's saving me so much money.
Boost your credit scores instantly. NoKidHungry.org right now will help provide healthy meals and hope.
The end of next week, and for next weekend, kind of getting back to where we should be this time of the...
For the rest of the weekend.
From Illinois, seek recognition.
As a member designated by Mr. Rush pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Rush will vote yes on HR 941. As a member designated by Mr. Moulton pursuant to HRES 8.
Last year, Dr. Fauci, they've been assaulted. Their liberties have.
I don't look at this as a liberty thing, Congressman Jordan.
Well, that's obvious.
As a public health thing.
But
I disagree with you on that.
You think the Constitution is suspended during a virus, during a pandemic? It's certainly not.
This will end, for sure, when we get the level of infection very low. It is now at such a high level, there's a threat again of major surge.
Dr. Fauci, over the last year, Americans' First Amendment rights have been completely attacked. Your right to go to church, your right to assemble, your right to petition your government, freedom of the press, freedom of speech have all been assaulted. I mean, for a year now, Americans haven't been able to go to church. Even today, when they go to church, they're limited in the size of worshipers who can meet. Your right to assemble? Oh my goodness. We had a curfew last fall in Ohio. You had to be in your home at 10. In Pennsylvania, you had to be in your home. When you're in your home, you had to wear a mask. In Vermont, when you were in your home, you didn't have to wear a mask, Dr. Fauci, because you weren't allowed to have people over to your house.
Yeah, Congressman Jordan.
Your ability to petition your government for a year, American citizens haven't been able to come to their capital to petition their government, to talk to their representatives, and freedom of the press. These very pictures that Representative Scalise just showed you and talked about, guess what? The press isn't allowed in those facilities. The press is not, the Biden administration will not let the press in there. And certainly freedom of speech. I mean, governor of our third largest state meets with physicians, and that video is censored because they dare to disagree with Dr. Fauci. So I just want to know, when do Americans get their First Amendment liberties back?
You know, I don't think anything was censored because they felt they couldn't disagree with me. I think you're making this a personal thing, and it isn't.
It's not a personal thing.
No, you are. That is exactly what you're doing.
No, your recommendations carry a lot of weight, Dr. Fauci. We just had the chair of the Financial Services Committee said she loves you and you're the greatest thing in the world.
My recommendations are consistent.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, it's my
Now, can I answer the question, please? My recommendations are not a personal recommendation. It's based on the CDC guidance, which is
and I'm asking the question, what measures have to be attained before Americans get their First Amendment liberties back?
I just told you that.
No, you haven't given anything specific. You said, we hope when this... Tell me specifically.
Right now, we have about 60,000 infections a day, which is a very large risk for a surge. We're not talking about liberties. We're talking about a pandemic that has killed 560,000 Americans.
I get that,
what we're talking about.
And I don't disagree with that. And I understand how serious that is, but I also understand it's pretty serious when businesses have been shut down. People can't go to church. People can't assemble in their own homes with their friends, with their families. People can't go to a loved one's funeral. People can't get to their government, petition their representative to redress their grievances. Right. I also understand the First Amendment's pretty darn important, and it's been a year, and I want to know when Americans will get those First Amendment liberties back.
Right, you just said people cannot assemble in their own homes. They can. That's a CDC recommendation for vaccinations.
Not last fall they couldn't.
I didn't hear.
Not last fall they couldn't.
I didn't hear what he said.
The gentleman's time has expired. I'll give you one instance of when we can get our liberties back. It's been 90%. The members of the United States Congress get vaccinated.
Well, I want to know if that's what Dr. Fauci, is it 90%,
That's what
Dr. Fauci? Is it 90%? That's what I'd like to know. Give us some objective standards versus when certain things get reached, we might be able to get back to having our liberty. When? What are the numbers?
Well, you're going to see a gradual, right now we're at an unacceptably high level. On a daily basis, it's unacceptably high, regardless of who you are. What you're going to see as more and more people get vaccinated, and we get over 3 million people a day, you're going to see the level of infection come down, and gradually there will be more flexibility for doing the things that you're talking about.
Where does it get to? When it comes down, what number do we get our liberties back? Tell me the number. Tell me the number.
90% of the members of Congress get vaccinated.
But you're not a doctor, Mr. Clyburn. He is. What is the number?
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Clyburn. Thank you.
Chair not recognizes for 5 minutes.
I'd like my question answered.
Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. Order. Regular order.
No, just a moment.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want you to answer my question. The American people want Dr. Fauci to answer the question. What does it have to be?
Expire, sir. If you need to respect the chair and shut your mouth.
Don't worry about this. We're going to handle this. And I think Mr. Jordan knows me very well. He knows full well that we're going to handle this. Your time has expired, and the chair now recognizes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Maloney.
Works. I used to watch that too, Dagan. Love that show.
See? Scott Bay. All right. And if you're into short shorts, Chubbies has all the short shorts you can handle. One more thing up next.
Espoused. What I was seeking to do was to hold up a mirror and put one racist theory alongside another to challenge people as to why we...
Staffer, James Hallinan, who claimed that the governor, during a meeting with other staffers present, dumped water on his crotch and then grabbed his crotch through his clothes.
To my knowledge, this is the first time that these types of allegations have been lodged against New Mexico's governor.
James Hallinan claims the incident happened during a meeting in 2018. He went public with the allegation the next year. Hallinan claimed he had trouble finding and keeping a job since he stopped working for the campaign. In an email to CNN, a spokesman for Lujan Grisham said the governor and her campaign, quote, strenuously deny that there is any merit or truth to Mr. Hallinan's claims, including his claims about difficulty finding or keeping work after the campaign. No lawsuit was ever filed by Hallinan. But CNN has obtained campaign finance documents showing Governor Lujan Grisham and her campaign paid Hallinan more than $62,000 to date in 5 installments between November of last year and March of this year to settle.
Writing a check is sometimes just the cost of doing business. It doesn't solve the problem, but it may make the problem a little bit less bad, and that's the goal.
Just last month, in an interview with the Washington Post, Governor Lujan Grisham weighed in on the sexual misconduct allegations by several women against New York Governor Andrew Cuomo.
We have to take seriously all these allegations, and I'm frankly in that group of elected leaders that you believe the individual, you give real credit and credibility there. If you don't, we're re-victimizing brave men and women who come forward.
Her campaign spokesman tells CNN
a big part of this.
Absolutely. Joey, to wrap us up here real quick, 9/29. We're going to hear a lot of that come Monday, aren't we?
There's no question about it. I think the prosecution will come out swinging, right? They have the burden of proof here, and as a result of that, they'll go last. Now, of course, the foundation will be laid by Nelson with respect to these issues of reasonable doubt, speaking about the use of force as being objectively reasonable. How he gets there, beyond me, but we're going to see how he does. What I'm also looking for, Mike, is to see whether he concedes anything, right? To the point of not rendering medical aid. What do you have to say about that, Mr. Nelson? It goes to the issue of manslaughter, negligence, etc. Your client is on notice. He knows the policies, the regulations, the procedures. Has he followed them? I think the defense will come back, with some indication of this reasonable doubt, reasonable doubt, reasonable doubt. We'll hear that a lot too, but I think the prosecution will close it out. And I'm also looking for any arguments in the alternative. What does that mean briefly, Mike? It means you have to convict there was an underlying assault. However, in the event you're not convinced, I think there are 2 other things. Lay him on his side. He didn't do that. That goes to depravity. And at the very least, he didn't follow protocol. Guilty on all 3 counts. We'll see what the defense does and what the prosecution does. I'm looking forward to it, as you are, Mike, and as our whole panel.
Absolutely. And we're going to get you ready. We are going to be delving into opening statements. Did both sides fulfill their promise to prove their points? We'll look at body camera footage and, of course, look at the emotions of the case. All this playing out, all the drama playing out on the 18th floor of that Hennepin County Government Center. It's where it's all going to go down on Monday. We'll see you.
Alice loves the scent of Gain so much, she wished there was a way to make it last longer. Say hello to your fairy godmother, Alice, and long-lasting Gain scent beads, part of the irresistible scent collection from Gain.
Supreme Court, which of course would then be selected by President Biden and possibly confirmed by a Democrat-run Senate already seeking to eliminate the filibuster. White House correspondent Kristen Fisher has details on all of this tonight, live from the North Lawn. Good evening, Kristen.
Brett, there are few things more controversial in Washington right now than killing the filibuster and packing the Supreme Court. But today, a group of congressional Democrats tied the 2 together by introducing a bill to try to increase the number of justices to 13. And they say...
Meanwhile, Wright's family, in this new incident, speaking out about what they've been going through this week, about what they think justice should look like. They spoke in a press conference today.
My son was very much loved. We loved him a lot. And the way he was killed, he did not deserve that. These young black men being killed. Can you blame my son or anyone else for being scared of the police?
I do want accountability, 100% accountability, but even then, when that happens, if that even happens, we're still going to bury our son.
This is the ritual, the process I've reported on, I've mentioned to you when we deal with these stories. There's the law, there's the evidence, there's the criminal justice process, and then there's the human beings. As we hear from a mother, forced in this time of grief to also try to be an activist or an advocate or something to get what they say will be justice. Speaking to her community and to the nation with all eyes on her under this stress, talking about, quote, burying her son. It's difficult. And then there's the other legal process playing out, and they're interrelated as we've reported because this new incident was brought up in the Chauvin trial 10 miles away. Today the news is the defense resting. They've done 3 weeks total. Derek Chauvin has formally invoked Fifth Amendment rights. That means no one can make him testify under oath on the stand about what he's accused of or in his own defense. And there was really a riveting moment when you think about how much has been said about Chauvin since the killing of George Floyd, since the video went around the world, and now in this recent trial. We have this moment now we can report for you where Chauvin actually spoke. Now, to be clear legally, I want you to understand the jury is not in the room for this, so you're going to see more than really the jury would as a viewer, as a citizen of this country, because it's open court to everyone but the jury for reasons of independence, and we heard from Chauvin.
Is this your decision not to testify?
It is, Your Honor.
All right. Do you have any questions about your right to remain silent or to testify on your own behalf?
Not at this time, I don't.
All right. Does anyone promise anything or threaten you in any way to keep you from testifying?
No promises or threats, Your Honor.
Do you feel that your decision not to testify is a voluntary one on your behalf?
Yes, it is.
That was the confirmation of that decision under that process. The closing arguments are expected to begin on Monday. For our coverage here on this trial and these issues, we're joined by NYU law professor Melissa Murray and Emily Bazelon, a legal writer for the New York Times Magazine. Professor Murray, we wanted to highlight that important moment, as I mentioned, for citizens, not the jury. What everyone thinks, and people can make up their own minds, what everyone thinks of this defendant in our system has these rights, and there is this moment there in a trial like this. Walk us through what we saw there and why it matters.
So each criminal defendant, all of us really, have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And in order to invoke that right, you do so in open court. And the colloquy between Officer Chauvin and the judge was basically to discern whether or not his invocation of his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination was voluntarily given, to make sure that it wasn't done in exchange for anything, that he basically understood what he was giving up and he was waiving his opportunity to testify on his own behalf, and it was done freely and knowingly.
Yeah, and that brings us to the strategic decision, Emily. This has been a trial we've covered where there has been a great deal of powerful evidence against Mr. Chauvin as a defendant. And I've covered, and I think folks have seen, how much humanizing evidence there's been about Mr. Floyd, which is to say at times they didn't even cross-examine the witnesses in the so-called spark of life and other rationales under state law, where basically you learn about who this person was as a human. With all that in mind, what do you think of the decision here by the defense not to put him on the stand, not to take what would have been their turn to potentially humanize him, but also expose him to great vulnerability?
Right. I mean, this is often the hardest decision that defendants and their lawyers have to make because, as you're saying, it's your chance to explain yourself. And I think even though we all have a Fifth Amendment right not to testify, and it's really important to remember that that does not imply guilt, it's natural for jurors to wonder about this person as a human being. And so you're sort of giving up that chance. On the other hand, it can be a real wild card to testify. And so I think it is really common for defendants and defense lawyers to feel like the safest course is just not to say anything. And so I think that's what we saw happen today.
Professor, your view on the decision?
Again, I said from the beginning, the biggest issue in this defense going forward is whether or not Mr. Chauvin would take the stand to try and bring his own perspective as to what happened on May 25th into the courtroom. But again, as Emily suggests, testifying in his own defense opened the door to a range of other issues the prosecution could have brought in on cross-examination, including his prior misconduct incidences that were in his employment file. So that would have been available to the prosecution to pursue as well, and that could have been incredibly damaging. But again, he had a right to invoke the Fifth Amendment. He took that right. He is not implying that he is guilty. If the jurors weren't there, they will be instructed that his invocation of the Fifth Amendment is not an indication of his guilt, but simply an invocation of a constitutional right.
Yeah. Now, I don't always do this, but Emily, can I tell you what I think of this strategic decision?
Please.
You know, sometimes I just anchor. But looking at this as a lawyer, I would have started the trial thinking you don't put him on the stand for the sound reasons that the professor just reminded us. It seems to me at this juncture, they're in such a hole that so much video has shown and so many experts have shown Mr. Chauvin to be making mistakes on the job. Again, I'm not saying whether he committed murder or not. The jury will decide that. But making such egregious mistakes on the job that it would seem to me, and I'm curious your response, Emily, that they're in such a hole that while they would risk the other negative stuff coming in, getting him as a human being, if he's able to try to make the case, whatever his defense would be, that he feels bad, that he may have made a mistake, but he didn't intentionally or with malice aforethought try to murder someone. Getting that defense in front of the jury when they're in this hole might sway one or two jurors with regard to doubt about the murder charges, because without him saying much, there was a lot of strong evidence, Emily, that really depicted him, again, I'm quoting the evidence, as quite depraved, and really just the video that played for these jurors. It gets harder and harder for the jurors to see him as a human being who may have made a mistake rather than, which is their defense, rather than what the portrait that emerged, Emily.
Right. I mean, the video is incredibly compelling evidence. I'm not sure the jurors can or should see beyond that. You could see at the beginning of a trial a chance that the medical case the defense was trying to make, oh, Mr. Floyd contributed to his own death, there were drugs in the system, these explanations might sway jurors. It seemed to me from what I watched the testimony that the prosecution's witnesses were much stronger on those fronts. And so I take your point, Ari, that at this point it's sort of like a Hail Mary pass, really. And maybe what you're talking about would convince a juror or two, which is all it takes on the murder charges. I'm not sure it would work on the manslaughter charge, which doesn't require the kind of depravity you were talking about. But maybe that's the case on the murder charges, then obviously that would be worth something. So, yeah, I see what you mean.
Professor?
Well, I was going to invoke for the first time a sports metaphor as well, and it was the Hail Mary pass. But I think you're right, Ari, that there was a need to humanize Officer Chauvin before this jury. The prosecution and the testimony of Felonious Floyd was so powerful on that last day of the prosecution's case, and it really painted George Floyd as a father, a son, a brother, a community member. And we haven't had a similar kind of treatment of Mr. Chauvin. All we have is this video and repeatedly the testimony of fellow officers saying that this was above and beyond what any officer would have done in that moment. And I think we needed to hear perhaps a little bit from Officer Chauvin about what he felt was going on in that moment. But again, an incredibly risky move, but maybe, as Emily says, this would have been the time to throw that down the line.
City, here is a live view from Dinosaur Hill. Yeah, you see the snowflakes there. Fortunately, the ground is pretty warm. You can see that down the street, for instance, the snow is pretty much melting when it hits the ground. As a result, the weather advisory for Rapid City is canceled, though it is going to continue to snow for the next day or day and a half. Right now, Rapid City sits at 33 degrees. The northwest breeze is at 5 miles per hour, and we do have the winter weather advisory advisory that continues for the southwest corner of South Dakota. We could see that 3 to 5 inches of snow. We would expect to see a light wintry mix moving out onto the plains during the day tomorrow, but it's not going to amount to a whole lot. Here's a look at Falls Park. You can see the clouds we've had all day long. The winds have been gentle out of the north, not nearly as strong as we've seen in recent days, but
holes you poked in their case, understanding that they haven't reached that reasonable doubt metric. And I, for the life of me, don't know what the criminal defense attorney's strategy was, other than throwing things against the wall to see what sticks.
Well, Paul, the closing arguments for both sides begin on Monday, so what does each side need to accomplish?
Well, you know, the prosecution team was a polished, well-prepared, and professional team. They called the best experts in the country on the use of excess force, but also in the field of medicine. A pulmonologist, the Irishman with a lilting accent and a spectacular resume, Dr. Tubin, who we heard twice in the trial. But we also heard from cardiologists, addiction specialists, we heard from pathologists, just a whole array of people, all united in saying that this was excessive force and that it caused the death of Mr. Floyd. The defense, on the other hand, is going to have to establish that, and this is the one thing they're going to try to say, is that George Floyd, because he was a drug user, a user of methamphetamine, and he had fentanyl in his system, and he had a weak heart, that he wasn't killed by excess force of Chauvin. He was killed by his own heart and his own personal problems. And I think they're going to be summing up on something that is kind of lingers in all of these police cases, and you always hear it, and that is, if he didn't surrender to the police, if he had just surrendered to the police voluntarily, maybe he would still be alive. In other words, it's blaming the victim in the case. And by the way, it's a defense that works in a lot of police misconduct cases. So it won't be said specifically, but that's the cloud that's going to hang over the case. Will the jury hang, or will they reach a verdict after looking at that issue?
Not guilty, you need all 12. Guilty, you need all 12. But if one or two decide there's a reasonable doubt, then there's a hung jury, and the prosecution has to decide whether to start from the beginning. Sarah, millions and millions of Americans protested George Floyd's death last year, as we all remember. You're there, and you're doing an amazing job for us, I must say. How high are the stakes with this verdict, which should be coming forward later next week?
I can't stress this enough. They couldn't be higher. This is not just a case that had an impact here in Minnesota and specifically in Minneapolis. This is a case that, as you mentioned, was a reaction worldwide from people who saw the video and just could not square what happened with the officer and George Floyd. I should also mention that I had a conversation not long ago today with Philonis Floyd, who has been in the court, inside the court, watching some of this testimony, and much of the dramatic testimony, and he talked about the fact that he is hoping, he is praying that the jury gives, and these are his words, the family justice. And they see it in a way that their only bit of evidence that they care about, the only bit of evidence that they feel anyone needed to see, is the video evidence taken by a 17-year-old bystander. Then you had the police body camera video evidence as well. And this family has been watching this video over and over and over again, but so has this city and the rest of the country and the world. And so there will be a huge reaction depending on what the jury decides. Wolf.
All right, guys, thank you very, very much. Just ahead, the lead lawyer after Dr. Jekyll and Mr.
Colors and images that bring joy to your life.
We'll be right back. Ending on this, your response to all of that.
Ari, it is the Trump playbook. Object, deflect, and project. It's about the deep state, the swamp. But the problem is that this investigation started under Bill Barr, the same guy who gave breaks to Rudy Giuliani and Paul Manafort and Flint. Gates.
Oxygen on the hemoglobin. You don't want the carboxy in it. It takes it over.
Then do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether this statement that Mr. Floyd's carboxy hemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18% is reliable?
No, I believe it is not reliable.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen why that statement is not reliable?
I base it on the arterial blood gas that was obtained when Mr. Floyd was in Hennepin County.
And with that, just even the word arterial blood gas, that meant wham, sidebar, and there you go. So at this point, we're all thinking, are we close to a mistrial? So there was a long sidebar, and then it was time to continue with the testimony of Dr. Martin Tobin. He's going to talk about oxygen levels. Is it worth all that we went through? Let's listen.
If you have, like was done in Mr. Floyd when he went to Hennepin County, he had an arterial blood gas obtained. So that's sticking a needle into the artery at the wrist, and you take out the blood. And then on the blood gas measurements, you measure a number of different items on that, like the pressure of oxygen in the blood, the pressure of carbon dioxide, the amount of acid in the blood called the pH, and you get all these different measurements, and you also get the oxygen saturation, and that is how much of the hemoglobin, the protein in the blood that carries the oxygen, how much of that hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. And we know in Mr. Floyd that it was 98% saturated.
So 98% saturated with oxygen?
With oxygen when they measured it in Hennepin County. And
So,
that was 9/16, the time frame.
So if we know that there's an oxygen saturation of 98%, does that tell us anything whatsoever?
Yes,
about what?
I'm sorry, I interrupted. I apologize.
Does that tell us anything whatsoever about what the carbon monoxide content could have been at a maximum in?
Yes, it does. It tells us that if the hemoglobin is saturated at 98%, it tells you all there was for everything else is 2%, and so the maximum amount of carbon monoxide would be 2%. It tells you the maximum amount of carboxyhemoglobin. That was what was mentioned yesterday. The maximum amount is 2%. It doesn't even tell you that it is 2%. It could be something else. But 2% of carboxyhemoglobin is within the normal range. You and I have levels of carboxyhemoglobin of somewhere between 0 and 3.
So there, the point made, 98% oxygen in George Floyd's blood, 2% carbon monoxide, and that's well within the normal range. Point there is the prosecution is trying to nullify this vehicle exhaust or carbon monoxide theory. Did they do that? Was Dr. Martin Tobin a strong finish for the prosecution in their rebuttal case? We'll talk about it with our expert panel when we come back. You're watching HLN in our continuing coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial.
Encourage everybody to seriously
question whether she'll be convicted.
Justice? What is justice? Do we get to see Dante smile? We don't get to see that. Do we get to hear Dante joke again? We don't get to hear that. Can we get a conviction? Can we get something? Manslaughter? Y'all see the difference? This is a taser. This is a taser. But no, my nephew was killed with this, a Glock.
We're joined now by the lead lawyer for Dante Wright's family, also the lead lawyer for George Floyd's family, by the way, Ben Crump. Ben, thanks very much for joining us. I know these are very, very difficult, painful days. You can hear the pain in her voice. Dante Wright's mother says justice would be Dante coming back home. So does the second-degree manslaughter charge fall short in the eyes of his family?
You know, as my great team of co-counsels and I sat with Dante's family and talked with them, a very profound question came up. Well, they said they don't know if Officer Potter has children. But they said if a police officer killed her child in the exact same manner that she killed Dante Wright, what would America demand? What would the charge be? Well, so much of this is about the over-policing of black people in America, the excessive use of force on marginalized minorities that we see different than what they use against white American citizens. So this is about equal justice under the law. And Minneapolis has become ground zero for this conversation, this most important conversation in America.
Dante Wright's funeral, of course, as you well know, will happen a week from today, next Thursday. What can you tell us about how his loved ones will remember him?
But you know, the one thing that was so heartening was when the mother of his child, China, talked about when Dante Jr. was born. He was born premature, and he was very, very small. They did not think he was going to make it. And Dante stayed at the hospital every night for weeks, and she said he would pray and just stay there and say, he's going to make it. We're going to have a healthy son. We're going to have a wonderful son. I'm his daddy. I'm going to make sure of it. And now, Dante Jr., this young black child, will have to grow up in America without a father. You add that to all the odds that are stacked against young black men, and it's just not fair. As his mother said, you know, regardless of what happens, there's no justice for her. There's no justice for them because Dante is never coming back. And it just seems as if everyone wants to give consideration to the police officer and say, oh, she just made a mistake. They are looking at what they lost compared to everybody saying, have compassion for her. And that doesn't seem fair.
Let's turn to the Derek Chauvin trial. It's only about 10 miles or so away from Brooklyn Center. The defense, as you know, rested its case today after calling just 7 witnesses over 2 days, compared, as I keep pointing out, the prosecution's decision to call 38 witnesses. What, if anything, does that tell you?
Well, I think that the defense is very hard because the video tells us that Officer Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd from an overdose of excessive force, or as Philonis, his brother, says, an overdose of knee on the neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And so I think it was probably challenging and difficult for them to find people who would stand in the defense of what we witnessed on that video. And so I do believe the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt in that Derek Chauvin should be held criminally liable for killing George Floyd.
As you know, closing arguments will begin on Monday, and then it goes to the jury. We don't know how long. It could take a few hours, could take a few days, maybe could take a few weeks. We have no idea. What do you anticipate?
Well, I anticipate that the jury will follow the law, follow the instructions of the court, and return a fair and impartial verdict based on the evidence. And hopefully, Wolf, they will give a measure of justice to George Floyd's family that will set a precedent that black people and marginalized minorities, no matter what race they are, can expect equal justice. That's hopefully the new precedence. And with Dante Wright, that's what we want is equal justice. They had a case in Minneapolis where a white woman, Justine Damon, was killed by a officer who was of African descent. And it has long been believed by the black community, as my co-counsel attorney Storm said, if a black officer killed a white person, then they would throw the book at them and they would be held fully accountable. And in that situation, it was a dark alley. It was very, very debatable whether he should have been charged at all. But the jury came back and convicted him of third-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 12.5 years. Now, he said he didn't mean to, just like they said Officer Potter did. But it seems that when comparing apples to apples, what will the jury do in the case of Officer Potter for killing Dante Wright? And that, hopefully as well, will be a precedence.
Yeah, we'll see what happens in both of these cases. Ben Crump, thanks as usual for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, President.
We'll go down to 200 and finish.
With our Doppler radar to just a simple temp check.
Finding an affordable rental as simple as 3
on a brand new deal to terminate and replace NAFTA.
Control that beyond watching and listening to what they do.
You know, we've been talking about it. Let's take everyone back one day. This is Dr. David Fowler on the stand. He's the defense expert, a former medical examiner, talking about this vehicle exhaust, carbon monoxide levels. Let's listen to that testimony, refresh everybody's memory.
Do you agree with me that there was no finding of carbon monoxide poisoning from Dr. Baker's autopsy review?
I do.
You mentioned an EPA standard of 9 parts per million on an 8-hour basis as the exposure limit for carbon monoxide. Remember that discussion?
Yes.
And you mentioned 35 parts per million, what I call a peak exposure, that is an exposure for a 1-hour time period.
That is correct, yes.
Now, you are not now, nor have you ever been an industrial hygienist, true?
Absolutely correct, I have not been.
How do you know the car was even on?
It was a question I specifically asked, and then I made an observation of water dripping from what appears to be a tailpipe.
So if I ask you directly, do you know if in fact the car was on or not? You didn't see any information or data from anybody who says I either turned the car on or I'm the one who turned it off. You didn't see either one, did you?
Correct.
It was the prosecutor, Jerry Blackwell, on the attack. Joey Jackson, outside of that, as we've hearkened back to Dr. Fowler's testimony, did he make that point? Did he make you stop and go, vehicle exhaust? Were you tracking with him at all?
You know, I had a problem with the whole carbon monoxide theory, Mike. I think that certainly as a defense attorney you want to raise doubt, but I think you want to do it in as credible a way as you can. You know, there's a bond of trust that you try to develop with the jury where what you say matters and what you argue matters and, you know, the points that you raise matter. But when you start going outside the realm of kind of reasonableness, it's kind of, to me, it's a loss. And I think this whole carbon monoxide thing was kind of fishing. You know, you have somebody there who's opining about carbon monoxide, bringing in something new, did no real analysis, doesn't know if the car's on or off, is making an assessment based upon a dripping tailpipe. Like, really? No, just didn't have the ring of credibility. And just one last point, if I could go back to my friend Eric Guster's point, and it's a significant one. It may not sound so, but he kind of raises the crazy uncle at a barbecue theory, or crazy cousin, as it were, at the barbecue theory. And obviously, you know, we respect jurors. That's why they're there, right? You go through this extensive voir dire process to get a jury that you think is fair and reasonable and just is going to listen to me. That's all you want. Just listen, keep an open mind, and be receptive to my arguments. You may reject them at the end, but be receptive. But you often worry, right, about whether or not this jury would be taken in by all of these different smoke screens and everything else, and you worry about the crazy uncle at the barbecue and whether they'll be brought into that. And where it comes in two quick ways, Mike. It comes into the issue of a mistrial as it relates to a hung jury, right? Excuse me, hung jury, not mistrial. where, you know, you have a situation where you have holdouts because they just don't want to buy into it. But then it comes into another thing, and it's what we call a compromise verdict, right? And so what happens in a compromise verdict, you have a number of jurors who say, no, he's guilty of the top count. That's the assault. It wasn't assault. Then you have the other jurors, no, he's an officer. He needed to gain control. But no, he didn't. He was under control. You have that argument. Okay, we'll go to depravity, okay?
Dr. Anthony Fauci says restrictions can be lifted, and his heated argument with a conservative member of Congress.
We're talking about a pandemic that has killed 560,000 Americans.
Emotional tribute. The family of Dante Wright reeling.
This is a taser, but no, my nephew was killed with this.
As the cop who shot him appears in court for the first time. Not testifying. After Derek Chauvin pleads the fifth, the defense and the prosecution rest. When will the jury decide? Chicago on edge. Graphic body cam video of officers fatally shooting a 13-year-old. Hoping for a miracle, the agonizing wait for families of crew members missing after their lift boat capsized off Louisiana. The royal rift. William and Harry won't walk together at Prince Philip's funeral. And Roots for Boots, serving the troops who served our country, thanks to a full-time angel.
This is the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell, reporting from the nation's capital.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We're going to begin tonight with breaking news. President Biden saying he's imposing tough new sanctions on Russia in retaliation for a crippling cyber attack and for interfering in U.S. elections. And he says he's willing to take further action if Vladimir Putin doesn't back off. The moves are the first significant U.S. sanctions in years, and they're designed to choke off Moscow's ability to borrow money. The White House also says it's kicking 10 Russian diplomats out of Washington immediately, saying they're actually spies. And for the first time, the U.S. is officially blaming Russia's intelligence service for that sweeping hack of software made by SolarWinds that was discovered in December. Now, the sophisticated cyber attack allowed Russia to infiltrate government agencies and thousands of major companies, potentially compromising everything from intelligence secrets to intellectual property. And there's also some major news as we come on the air from Pfizer, the company's CEO saying tonight anyone at Pfizer's 2-dose COVID vaccine may need a third shot in the coming months. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But we are going to begin tonight with CBS's Weijia Jiang, who's going to lead off our coverage from the White House. Good evening, Weijia.
Nora, good evening. President Biden said he was clear with Vladimir Putin that he could have taken even harsher action and warned if Russia continues its bad behavior next time, he will. He also proposed they have a summit in Europe this summer to talk about a wide range of pressing issues.
When Russia seeks to violate the interests of the United States, we will respond.
Tonight, President Biden is drawing a line in the sand, imposing strict new sanctions on dozens of Russian companies and individuals, and expelling 10 Russian diplomats who the White House says are spies. The penalties are in response to Moscow's interference in the 2020 presidential election and for carrying out the SolarWinds cyber hack that accessed sensitive data, including intelligence and nuclear secrets from U.S. government agencies and 18,000 major U.S. companies, including Microsoft, in what may be the most widespread and sophisticated hack in history.
I was clear with President Putin that we could have gone further, but I chose not to do so. I chose to be proportionate.
He is willing to be extraordinarily tough with Putin if Putin continues his malign behavior.
Middle of the night, his child was in contact with an adult who had a gun. There are a number of forces that met up at 2:30 in the morning on March 29th in an alley. And simply put, we failed at him.
And Pierre Thomas with us tonight, live from Washington. And what more have you learned, Pierre?
David, the officer has been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. As for family members, their attorneys released a joint statement with the mayor saying the release of the video is a first step toward healing. And David, they're calling for peace.
Our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, leading us off tonight. Pierre, thank you. We turn next year to the coronavirus in the U.S. Tonight, the CEO of Pfizer now suggesting Americans will need a third shot, a booster shot, within a year of being vaccinated. That suggestion comes amid worrisome new numbers tonight. Hotspots flaring up as the variants spread. New cases actually climbing more than 30% in a month. In Michigan alone, hospitals are overwhelmed, some setting out those outdoor triage centers like we saw in the beginning of this pandemic. And on Capitol Hill today, Dr. Anthony Fauci, in a heated exchange, is asked when America... It's about 560,000 Americans lost. Here's Whit Johnson.
Tonight, a growing emergency in Michigan. Beaumont Health System overwhelmed with 800 COVID patients at 8 hospitals, now setting up outdoor triage centers to handle the surge.
Where we currently are in our third surge, which is just like a runaway train right now.
24 of Michigan's hospitals are at 90% capacity.
The healthcare workers are tired, they're frustrated, they're being told to do more with less.
Across the country, COVID cases climbing 31% in the last month. And today, frustration boiling over on Capitol Hill. Dr. Fauci facing off with Congressman Jim Jordan.
When do Americans get their freedom back? And we get the level of infection in this country low enough that it is not a really high. What is low enough? Give me a number.
Dr. Fauci then saying this isn't about liberties. It's about the hundreds of thousands of lives lost.
Right now, we have about 60,000 infections a day, which is a very large risk for a surge. We're not talking about liberties. We're talking about a pandemic that has killed 560,000 Americans.
The CEO of Pfizer saying Americans will likely need a booster, a third shot within 12 months of getting fully vaccinated, and that it's possible they will need to get vaccinated every year. This after a CDC advisory panel extended a pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to investigate rare blood clots in 6 women. The fallout swift. Some vaccination sites already seeing a dip in demand.
It's pretty unfortunate because there's so much fear about the vaccines already.
Many of the 7,000 locations that were only offering Johnson & Johnson now scrambling to make other vaccines available. But the extended pause getting pushback from some health experts.
Look at this as a liberty thing, Congressman Jordan.
Well, that's obvious. What measures have to be attained before Americans get their First Amendment liberties back?
I just told, we're not talking about liberties. We're talking about a pandemic that has killed 560,000 Americans.
This is the largest federal vaccination site in Pennsylvania, administering 6,000 Pfizer vaccines every single day.
When it comes to intelligence, does that make a difference when confronting Russia?
Very much so. And something that should not be overlooked here. For 4 years, the leaders of our intelligence community during the Trump presidency were constantly looking over their shoulder, afraid of saying something that was going to anger the boss, that was contrary to what the boss wanted to believe. The hearings today on Capitol Hill by our intelligence community leaders were a refreshing reminder that the intelligence community is supposed to call it like they see it, without fear of retribution from their political masters. Avril Haines and the others who testified inspire confidence, and should inspire confidence in all of us in this country, and should show resolve to our adversaries, our competitors, and our enemies. I think we're in a much better place in terms of the credibility of our intelligence community these days.
Former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, as usual, thanks so much for joining us.
As people get older and struggle with
the attack.
Eric Chauvin trial. This has been played in court. It's
Hope for short. Nora? SIOUX, thank you. Well, tonight there is shock and sadness in Chicago after the city today released body cam video of an officer shooting and killing a 13-year-old boy. We want to warn you that this video is disturbing. The mayor and the boy's family are asking the community to express their grief peacefully. Here's CBS's Adriana Diaz.
The chase lasted 20 seconds before an officer opened fire.
Show me your ass. Stop it.
A single shot struck the chest of 13-year-old Adam Toledo. Police say he had a gun in his right hand.
I'm going to start CPR. I'm not feeling heartbeat.
Officer Eric Stillman, who's now on administrative duty, tried to revive him.
Hey, stay with me, buddy.
But the boy was pronounced dead at the scene. Police say a semi-automatic pistol was recovered a few feet away. The incident began around 2:30 a.m. on March 29th when gunshots were picked up by a police audio scanner. Less than a minute later, police encountered Toledo and 21-year-old Ruben Roman, who was tackled. Today, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who was a 13-year-old of her own, called for calm.
No parent should ever have a video broadcast widely of their child's last moments. Much less be placed in a terrible situation of losing their child in the first place.
I just want to know what really happened to my baby.
Days after his death, Toledo's mother demanded answers.
They had a lot of options, but not kill him.
Toledo's family said one of Adam's dreams was to be a police officer. Nora, the city of Chicago is preparing for protests tonight.
All right, Adriana Diaz, thank you. Tonight, the search continues off the Louisiana coast for 12 crew members of a ship that capsized on Tuesday in a violent storm. And infrared scans indicate 2 of the missing may be in the hull alive. CBS's David Begnaud is in Port Fourchon, Louisiana. Good evening, David.
Nora, good evening. It's happening right now. You've got divers trying to actually break into the hull of the ship to figure out whether or not at least 2 men are still alive. Earlier, Nora, they took a hammer to that hull, banging on it to see if anyone would bang back or yell back at them, but they heard nothing.
These photos were just released by the Coast Guard showing their rescuers at the site of the wreckage today. The Coast Guard tells CBS News that when the lift boat capsized on Tuesday, rescue crews actually dropped life jackets and radios to 5 men seen sitting on the hull of the boat, which is still partially exposed. Now, according to the Coast Guard, 2 of those men radioed that they were going back into the hull of the boat. And that was the last radio transmission the Coast Guard heard at 9:53 p.m. on the night of the wreck. With the search now in its 3rd day, families are not only restless, but they're starting to get frustrated. Scott Daspit's son, Dylan, is one of the missing.
I have a boat coming here myself, and I'm going out, because who knows how far they've drifted now.
He was not kidding. We were there when Daspit got on that boat and went out to help aid in the search to find his son. But before he left, he told us this about Dylan.
He's got a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, 2 grandsons that love their daddy very much.
Dylan is among the 19 people on the ship when it capsized during a storm that had 90-mile-per-hour winds and waves higher than 10 feet.
He's got the spirit to make it. But I just like to know if he's on the water, I'm going to find him.
Still worried about their loved ones. Tonight, Scott is still on that boat out at sea, hell-bent and determined not to come back here to this fire station to meet his family until he knows whether Dylan is dead or alive. Nora.
Oh, I am so thinking of those families and the pain they're going through. David Begnaud, thank you. There is some good economic news tonight. Retail sales jumped 9.8% in March, and that sent the stock market soaring. The Dow closed above 34,000 for the first time.
Because obviously the city of Chicago deals with a lot of gun violence. There's often a stat that is talked about that Chicago confiscates more guns than Los Angeles and New York combined. The officer responded, and they said that shooting and the turning happened in less than 2 seconds. So you see the split-second decision that was made there by the officer. Those freeze frames that are on the Chicago Police website show what they believe is that gun in his hand. There was a gun recovered on scene. But you hear that family attorney saying that he dropped the gun before being shot. 1 shot was fired. Another thing here is that officer responded very quickly to render aid to the 13-year-old after he shot him that 1 time in the chest. But obviously, there's a lot of tension, and we felt that throughout the day, especially with the mayor giving an impassioned speech about how we need to do a better job with gun violence. in the city. Wolf?
All right, Ryan, I want you to stay with us. I also want to bring back CNN political commentator, the attorney Bakari Sellers, and CNN legal analyst Paul Callan. I want to play the video for our viewers to see one more time. Let's watch it. It's very disturbing, but let's watch it, and then we'll assess. There you see a gun on the ground over there, Bakari. Obviously difficult to watch, painful to think that a little 13-year-old boy was shot in the process. What's your initial reaction to when you watch that video?
I mean, it's sad, it's exhausting having to go through this again. You know, talking off air, I wish we were here under different circumstances. There's no doubt that there is a problem in Chicago. There's no doubt that the guns that flow into Chicago from Indiana is a problem, been a problem for a long time. But here again, you have law enforcement, and you give a command, it's a split-second decision, and it's the wrong decision. But Wolf, let me just highlight something else. I know you're moving on, but to Paul and others, but this is a perpetual state of grieving that we have in these black and brown communities, these communities that are just being ravaged by this state-sanctioned violence. And to have a 13-year-old boy that could be any one of our children, a boy in the truest sense of the term, be killed like this, there's really no excuse for it.
And you look at that picture, it is so heartbreaking to think about that 13-year-old boy who was shot and killed. Paul, officers were responding to what's called a shots fired call. What's your reaction when you see how quickly this fatal shooting of this 13-year-old unfolded?
Well, you know, Wolf, we're getting a look at what the tragedy that goes on in a lot of dark alleys, I think, in big cities across America. It used to be there was no video, so it was the cop's word and against the suspect if he survived. Here we see it on video. This one is going to be a real tough case, I'll tell you. It's a tragedy because a 13-year-old was involved, but if he had a gun in his hand and he was starting to turn toward the officer, the law says in Illinois that the officer had the right to use deadly physical force. Now, on the other hand, if the 13-year-old had dropped the gun to the ground, the use of deadly force would be illegal in Illinois and every place else in the United States, and in fact, the officer could be charged with a crime. And it's that split second that's going to decide how this case is handled by the prosecutor ultimately. It's a tough case to handle and investigate.
It certainly is. You know, Bakari, the police say the boy had a gun in his hand. The family's lawyer, as we heard, says he had nothing in his hand at the time he was shot. Clearly, there was no attempt to slow this down or to de-escalate here, was there?
No. I mean, and Paul's absolutely right on the law, but what we see is frame by frame. And then, Wolf, and Ryan may be able to add a little clarity on this, but a prosecutor stood up today in open court earlier today and stated that this young boy had a gun in his hand. It's not just the act, but it's the cover-up that goes along with it. This puts me in the immediate mind frame of Rahm Emanuel completely covering up the death during his election of Laquan McDonald. This happens in Chicago way too much. And, you know, thank God for body cameras, but that's just one step. Body cameras are covering after you already kill us. The point we have to get to is stop killing us. That is the point. And the exhaustion is because only in America can you be in the middle of a trial in closing arguments for a cop killing a black man with a knee on his neck, only to be interrupted by a cop accidentally killing another black man, only to be interrupted by a 13-year-old boy in an alley turning around with no gun in his hand being shot. Should the boy have been out there? No. Should there have been guns in the streets of Chicago? No. But at the end of the day, this cop should not have shot this young boy.
I want to bring back the former Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, who's been watching all of this unfold. Very hard to watch, as we know, but let me get your reaction. to what we're seeing. It's so painful to think about that 13-year-old boy shot and killed.
Well, if that was the first time I saw that video, I have two thoughts. One, which I've said before, there are simply far too many gun carriers with a badge in this country who don't know how to respond in a crisis situation, in a tense moment. Training, training, training. I know this because the Department of Homeland Security is the largest department of federal gun carriers, civilian, in our national government. And you cannot train enough someone with a gun and a badge how to respond in a crisis. And there are far too many instances where officers lose their head. We saw this in Chicago now. We saw this in Brooklyn Center with the mistake of the weapon for the taser. Too many police officers don't know how to deal in a crisis. The other thought is the point that was made a moment ago. Where would we be in assessing all of this and bringing all this to light if there were not body cameras, if civilians did not walk around with these? The George Floyd case could not even have been prosecuted were it not been for a camera. This Chicago incident would not come to light had it not been for a camera. I strongly suspect that if there had been no camera on George Floyd, there would have been a police report written up that said police officer put his knee on his back, he had a heart condition, he died unfortunately, and it would have been tucked away in a file. And so we're getting a raw look at something that is not new. What is new is that America sees it, but use of excessive force directed against communities and individuals of color is not new. And let's hope that America finally responds to this and rises up, white and black. This is not just a black problem. This is an American problem. Let's hope that we all rise up and insist on change.
Yeah, so it is an American problem. We got to do something about it. You and I have known each other for a while, and earlier this week we spoke after that other very disturbing video came out of a police stop of a U.S. Army active duty second lieutenant in Virginia. It hit home for you, it hit home for me, but why do we keep seeing these incidents over and over and over again?
Wolf, I'm a student of history, and I believe that a lot of what we see directed against people of color, directed against black men, is a legacy from the time when black people in this country were not regarded as human beings. There's a Supreme Court decision called Dred Scott that said that a slave is not a person, is not a citizen. And I believe we are still wrestling with the legacy of a time in our country when people of color were not regarded as full human beings. You look at the George Floyd video over and over, it looks as if it's not a peace officer dealing with a civilian in the community. It's as if he's the hunter and George Floyd is the prey, and he's snuffing his life out. And so we still wrestle with this problem, and someday we're going to be able to get past this. But this has to be on our national agenda. Both.
Yeah, it certainly does, and I keep saying to you and to Bakari, Paul, and everybody else, we've got to stop meeting around these occasions. It's happening way, way too frequently, and as you correctly point out, because of the cell phone, the cameras, the body cameras, we're seeing it, but it's been going on for decades, for years and years and years. We simply didn't see it. As a result, it's so painful to watch, right? Secretary, thank you so much for joining us.
Exit 73, and everyone's raving about Rebel.
And they definitely don't show.
State 99.
Yup. It's made for this guy.
That they have, along with government capabilities, and these are folks outside of the civilian agencies, that have that intelligence, because that's what the federal
does the same.
And tablet to keep when you graduate.
4+ years to
guaranteed for life. Your engine, transmission, and
Well, maybe.
horrible. And yes, Edith wants to put for
Abuse lighting.
travel changes people in the best way.
One inhaler. Trilogy helps people breathe easier. Voice tap.
Millions has actually led to phone calls from family and friends he's missed during this pandemic.
I've been getting tons of supportive messages from friends, family, people that I haven't talked to in a really long time. So it's nice to hear from those people.
Smiling through it all. Send over some new nachos, and you hear from family and friends too. So all's well that ends well. Good night.
Jackson, I need you.
Because Ford SUVs are built for this,
Troubled by falls and bleeds, worry follows you everywhere.
And if you can't watch us live, set your DVR so you can watch us later. That is tonight's CBS Evening News. I'm Nora O'Donnell. See you tomorrow. Good night.
Stroke risk and bleed.
Serving part-time in the Army National Guard instills pride that you and your
Week, and I think once the Taliban realize that we're leaving and we're taking.
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
You can see his eyes, he's conscious, and then you see that he isn't. And that's the moment the life goes out of his body.
it's news when you want it. With a news bureau just minutes from the state capitol, Dakota News Now has politics covered.
Holding the powerful accountable, asking the tough questions.
Dakota News Now. It's news when you want it. Eric, Vanessa, and Aaron. Weekday mornings on Dakota News Now.
Tonight, the vital new information for the millions of Americans who've received Pfizer's COVID vaccine. Pfizer's CEO saying a third dose will likely be needed within 12 months of becoming fully vaccinated. Will you have to get one every year, like the flu shot? Johnson & Johnson's vaccine remaining on pause. Millions still within the 13-day window when 6 women developed blood clots. And the first CDC data on breakthrough infections among fully vaccinated people. What's your potential risk? The disturbing new body cam, an officer fatally shooting a 13-year-old in Chicago. Police saying a gun was found at the scene, but the video appearing to show the boy's hands up as he shot. Chicago's mayor pleading for calm. The defense resting in the Derek Chauvin trial, the former officer speaking in court for the first time to invoke his Fifth Amendment right not to testify, when the jury will hear closing arguments. Dante Wright's family speaking out for the first time since the former officer was charged in his shooting death, what they're demanding tonight. The U.S. hitting Russia with new sanctions and the warning President Biden says he personally gave to Vladimir Putin, and bracing for a blast of spring snow.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. We may be closer to a definitive answer to one of the nagging questions about COVID vaccines, and that is, will we need a follow-on booster shot later on? Well, the head of Pfizer is saying that will likely be the case for his company's vaccine, suggesting an annual shot could be in the cards beginning a year after being fully vaccinated. The idea to keep your body's defenses up against the virus, especially the variants. We'll also dig into the number of people infected despite being fully vaccinated. Some interesting numbers to share with you there, especially considering 126 million have received at least one COVID vaccine dose in this country. We're also watching hospitalizations tonight at 38,000. Let's begin our coverage now with Miguel Almaguer.
On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
For the tens of millions of Americans inoculated with the Pfizer vaccine, tonight new word, they'll likely need a third shot, a booster dose, within 12 months of being fully vaccinated. Pfizer's CEO says, like the flu shot, the vaccine could be annual.
the variants will play a key role. It is extremely important to suppress the pool of people that can be susceptible to the virus.
The Pfizer news comes as the future of the Johnson & Johnson shot remains unclear, but just the decision to pause is having an impact.
I saw patients today who were scheduled for Johnson & Johnson, and when I told them we needed to reschedule, they're like, no, thank you.
With 7.6 million Americans already inoculated with J&J, the 6 women with rare blood clotting experienced it within 2 weeks. Roughly 3.8 million people are still in that window.
Some hospitals, like this one, say in recent days those just inoculated with J&J have been showing up to their ERs with no symptoms and no medical problems, but are instead overly concerned.
Today on Capitol Hill, leading health officials sought to reassure the public. At a time when COVID cases are climbing, authorities are trying to ensure public confidence isn't dropping. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News.
All right, let's put it into context. Dr. John Torres joins us now. John, if Pfizer is talking yearly booster shots, what does it say about how long the vaccines provide protection right now?
We know the vaccines are very effective in providing at least 6 months of protection from the virus, but until they study immunity of recipients 6 months out, we're not going to know conclusively. Now, Pfizer thinks we'll need a booster shot in 12 months time frame and maybe annually after that. Moderna says they're working on a booster shot and hoping to combine it with the flu vaccine so you can get both at once. What we don't know at this point is whether you can switch between different types of vaccines for that booster shot, but hopefully we'll soon.
All right, Doctor, thank you. Well, let's turn now to the breaking news from Chicago. Police video just released of a deadly officer-involved shooting. This one involved a 13-year-old boy. It happened late last month. We need to warn you, the images are disturbing. Rahema Ellis is there.
In a dramatic police body cam video, officers are responding to a call of shots fired in the early morning hours of March 29th in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood. In a matter of seconds, a pursuit turns deadly. 13-year-old Adam Toledo was killed. Police say a gun was found at the scene.
The officer screamed at him, "Show me your hands." Adam complied, turned around. His hands were empty when he was shot in the chest.
So far, police have not released any information about the officer. They arrested a 21-year-old man who they say was with Toledo at the time.
Then, put your hand behind your back.
Reuben Roman, arraigned Saturday, was charged with child endangerment and reckless discharge of a firearm. Chicago's mayor became emotional today talking about the video.
No parent should ever have a video broadcast widely of their child's last moments.
Earlier this week, Toledo's family saw the video and did not want it seen immediately. But today they agreed it should be viewed by the public, and they called for calm. Now that the video has been released, the city is on edge tonight and bracing for more demonstrations. Lester?
All right, Rahema, thank you. In Minneapolis, high drama in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin. The defense resting its case and the former police officer making his decision on whether to testify about the death of George Floyd. Our Gabe Gutierrez has late details.
It had been one of the largest questions looming over the trial, whether Derek Chauvin would take the stand in his own defense. Today, the answer.
I will invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege today.
Chauvin told the judge, without the jury in the room, that he would not testify.
I have advised you, and we have gone back and forth on the matter, would be kind of an understatement, right?
Yes, it is.
George Floyd's younger brother, Rodney, says it had been on his mind.
I was hoping to see him get on that stand, but he didn't do it. You wanted to see him testify. Yeah, I wanted to see him do something to accept some accountability.
But legal experts saying Chauvin's choice is no surprise.
The biggest risk for putting Derek Chauvin on the stand is that he does the exact opposite of what you want him to do. Instead of humanizing himself, he comes across as looking cold to the jury, which further proves what the state is already trying to establish, that he's a direct cause of George Floyd's death.
Also today, prosecutors tried to introduce as new evidence test results that specifically measured the carbon monoxide in Floyd's blood. The judge did not allow it.
It's untimely.
Scolding them for waiting until the last minute and warning that bringing up the previously undisclosed lab test to the jury could result in a mistrial.
This late disclosure is
not the way we should be operating here.
Instead, the prosecution called a sole rebuttal witness, Dr. Michael Tobin, back to the stand. The world-renowned pulmonologist disagreed with yesterday's defense expert, who testified exhaust from the police squad car could have been one of the contributing factors in Floyd's death.
I believe it is not reliable.
Closing arguments are now set for Monday. Then the case will go to the jury, which will be sequestered.
If I were you, I would plan for long and hope for short. Whether it's an hour or a week, it's entirely within your province.
Gabe, I'm curious, why is the court waiting until Monday for closing arguments?
Well, Lester, the judge had indicated that he did not want the jury deliberating this weekend. Also, the prosecution and defense are still hammering out the exact wording for jury instructions, Lester.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez tonight, thank you. In just 60 seconds, packing the Supreme Court. The controversial proposal in Congress to expand it to 13 justices. And in our series, American Extremism, a program to help people get out of hate groups.
On the deliciousness.
5 years ago, and you can expect that to be the case going forward.
And Michael, when you look at the list of the entities and the individuals sanctioned today, what does it tell us, or what does it tell you about sort of Russian tradecraft and intentions?
Well, it's kind of extraordinary, isn't it? So for one thing, they have now named AP-29, again, an actor that was very familiar to those of us who were paying attention to the 2016 election interference campaign, because they had also hacked into DNC computer systems. They didn't get quite as much attention by the media, though, because they weren't the ones that leaked that information to WikiLeaks, right? That was the GRU, Russia's military intelligence service. But today the U.S. government also asserts that APT-29, also known as Cozy Bear, is an arm of the SVR, which is to say Russia's Foreign Civilian Intelligence Service. These are the actors who did the so-called SolarWinds hack, right? A massive data breach which affected not only private companies in the United States, but also U.S. government institutions. And what we're seeing now in terms of the tradecraft of cyber operations between the GRU, Russia's military intelligence service, and the SVR, their civilian foreign service, is one of a degree of public impact, you might say. The SVR likes to do data collection. It likes to exfiltrate information for internal Russian use. The GRU steals stuff, and then it disseminates it, or it tries to even shut down digital infrastructure. The GRU was responsible, for instance, for the NotPetya malware attack, which for a period of about 48 hours almost crippled global commerce several years ago. They also hacked into the Olympics a few years ago. Again, the U.S. government has now certified what a lot of cybersecurity analysts have been saying for many, many years, but couldn't themselves prove. So this is actually a major set of revelations by the U.S. government. And as Angela said, I mean, it depends on who you're asking. Do sanctions actually prove the case with a sufficient body of evidence? Well, in terms of being a journalist and reporting on these issues, it certainly makes our job a lot easier to make allegations and assertions that we otherwise could only speculate at just a few hours ago.
Angela, I wanted to return to you. President Biden said he doesn't want a spiral of escalation, but do you think that President Putin is going to feel the need to respond somehow?
I think he will feel the need to respond. I think for domestic reasons, his popularity has been going down, and there are rumors about, instability there. So I think he will definitely feel the need to show that he's strong, that the U.S. can't push Russia around. Those certainly are the signals we heard today from his foreign ministry spokesman and others. So you could see more diplomatic personnel, U.S. ones, expelled from Russia than we are going to expel from the U.S. today, maybe not. You could see other actions maybe that won't be visible to the public in the cyber realm. So I do not expect immediately President Putin to suddenly respond to the more conciliatory message today from President Biden. And I think we may be in for a few weeks or months of a deteriorating situation. I really would watch the situation around Ukraine, where Russia is building up its military forces, where no one is quite sure what its next move will be, but has gotten the Ukrainians and their neighbors very worried.
Angela Stent of Georgetown University, investigative journalist Michael Weiss. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coming up, CNN says the quiet part out loud why an employee admits their goal is to help Black Lives Matter. More after the break.
But I have never seen a cop, let alone that many police officers, testify against a fellow police officer. If Derek Chauvin is convicted, it will be because of that and because of Mr. Tobin, who I want to take a class from. Katie Fang and Jason Johnson, I want to take a class with both of y'all too as well, because you guys are great professors as well. Thank y'all very much. Up next on the Readout, a deeper look at America's policing crisis. The officer, former police officer who shot and killed Daunte Wright, makes her first appearance in court, as we get our first look at the body cam video in the killing of a 13-year-old boy by a Chicago police officer. Plus, the government finally connects the dots between the 2016 Trump campaign and Russian intelligence. No collusion, you say? No, collusion. And then there's tonight's absolute worst.
Dating back to your days when in school, when you seemed to argue that African Americans were genetically superior to Caucasians.
Nope, no sir, nope, that did not happen. The shameless and embarrassing Republican effort to smear a black woman who was in line to lead the DOJ Civil Rights Division. The Readout continues after this.
It doesn't happen.
Reduced by inflammation due to chronic dry eye. Prostasis didn't.
Today, don't miss out on another camping season. Hurry in.
Video of the shooting death of 13-year-old Adam Toledo by a Chicago police officer. The video shows the officer yelling commands for the 13-year-old to stop running and show his hands. We've slowed down the video to show you what police tell us is a gun in the teen's hand. A few seconds later, the police shooting plays out. Less than 1 second passes from the time the teen starts to turn and when the officer fires. Late Thursday, an attorney for the family disputed reports the teen had a gun in his hand when he was shot.
This is why I want to be especially clear right now that that child complied. Adam complied with the officer's request, dropped the gun, turned around. The officer saw his hands were up and pulled the trigger.
On March 29th, police responded to the location on the city's west side after ShotSpotter technology alerted them to more than a half dozen gunshots. Video released Thursday appears to show a male shooting toward a car. A Chicago police officer arrives, a foot chase ensues.
No parent should ever have a video broadcast widely of their child's last moments. Much less be placed in the terrible situation of losing their child in the first place.
Ahead of the videos released Thursday afternoon by the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, an emotional Mayor Lori Lightfoot calling for the city to remain calm.
Even as our understanding of this incident continues to evolve, this remains a complicated and nuanced story. And we all must proceed with deep empathy and calm, and importantly, peace.
And in a joint statement with the city, the boy's family also calling on the city to remain peaceful. In a statement released through their attorney saying the experience was extremely difficult and heartbreaking for everyone present, and especially for Adam's family. Adam's memory can be best honored by refraining from violence and working constructively for reform. Aaron, let's be clear here. The city of Chicago's police department has had a strained relationship with communities of color for years, and this has gone back and forth with the mistrust in the community for the police department. This is really tearing at that wound in this city, because there are people who watch that video and don't believe that it lined up the way police say it does. But when you look at how the police department presented it, it said basically the officer had a split-second decision. He knew he was responding to a shots fired call. He saw that weapon in the young man's hand and felt like he had to fire. The other thing there is, as soon as that shot was fired, he ran over to render aid. But there are a lot of questions tonight about how this was handled. We'll see what happens in the next few hours in terms of whether or not there'll be large-scale protests or not.
All right, thank you very much, Ryan. And I want to go now to Isaiah McKinnon, former Detroit police chief and also the former deputy mayor of Detroit, and John Burris is back with me. Chief McKinnon, let me just start with you because, look, this is very disturbing video, but what's in it is obviously extremely important here. Officers were responding to an alert for shots fired. They show up on the scene and they encounter Adam Toledo, 13-year-old in a dark alley. The police say he had a gun in his hand and there was a split-second decision. Family says Toledo dropped the gun and the police saw him do that and then shot him anyway. What do you see when you see the video?
I've viewed the video a number of times, and it's troubling, but the reality is it shows you how difficult it is for anyone, in particular law enforcement officers, in those kinds of situations. I saw a gun, well, let's go back. I saw the officer chasing this person, and I heard him yell at the man to drop the gun. The person dropped the gun, and I saw him turn. It's a split-second decision that has to be made by the officer, and unfortunately, it was not a wise thing to do, number one, to have a weapon, but number two, when you make those kinds of decisions to make those moves, the officer has a right to protect him or herself.
Right, and does it add up to you, Chief, when you look at, they say split-second decision. I mean, literally, you could be talking at such a split second here that a trigger could be being pulled before someone registered that a gun was being dropped. I mean, when you see this, and then you see how the officer behaved afterwards, right, calling for help immediately, trying to get an ambulance, does the police version of this add up to you, all in? It sounds like it does.
Yeah, the follow-up even by the officer was above and beyond. But let me tell you, I can recall a situation a number of years ago when I stopped a young man who had a weapon. And I told him to drop the gun. It was a toy gun. You don't know that. I didn't shoot the young man. But the fact is that I could have. Now, I'm not trying to justify anything other than the fact that these are harrowing situations and split-second decisions. And I listened to the officer, I listened to his partner, whomever it was with him, who were trying to save this young man after this situation. It doesn't make it better in terms of losing one's life, but the reality is that this is one of those situations where we don't want to happen, but everyone wants to go home to their families.
Right, and you can understand it. John, let me ask you. Police release, an edited video of what happened as well, with an arrow pointing to what they say is the gun in Adam Toledo's hand. Body camera from one of the officers also clearly shows a gun near Toledo's body after the shooting. But the lawyer for the family is, they're insisting and that he didn't have a gun in his hand when he was shot. Let me just play what she said.
If he had a gun, he tossed it. The officer said, "Show me your hands." He complied. He turned around. If you're shooting an unarmed child with his hands in the air, it is an assassination.
Look, that's a pretty incredible thing to say, okay? So when you look at that, John, and you see this, having been involved in defense cases, did this look like shooting an unarmed child like an assassination?
Well, it's a close question. When I look at something like this, I want to know about the police officer's tactics. Mm-hmm. Did you rush into a situation where you did not allow yourself to be in a position of cover, but therefore you didn't have the real time that was necessary to assess the situation, mm-hmm. and then shoot or don't shoot? Here was a situation by putting himself in kind of that position. He wasn't in a position to really properly assess whether the child was in fact dropping the weapon and turning around. That's the part that I see as dangerous from the police point of view, that they really shouldn't have chased this kid in the way that they did without making sure they had a position of cover so that the kid would be in a position to comply. Here, whether he complied or not, he had no chance. And that's the part that I see as most devastating, that the kid didn't have a chance. And if the other people say if he had a gun, he tossed the gun, was it enough? If the officer was in a position of safety, he could have observed that, as opposed to exercising a split-second decision, if you will, only because he perceived the kid was turning around. That's what I thought was the real problem here, that he didn't give himself an opportunity to assess the situation properly.
So, Chief McKinnon, let me ask you about that. This is a dark alley at night. They get a call for, shots fired. They show up. Then it's chasing, right? Turns out it's a very young boy. Officer turns around, the boy turns around, officer yells him to stop. The whole thing goes down so quickly. Tell me what goes through an officer's mind during a situation like this.
This is one of those situations that we talked about and discussed for some time. I've chased people. I've been shot at 8 times. Thank God they missed. But the reality is it's a split-second decision. And you as a law enforcement officer who trained to make those kinds of split-second decisions and not use a term like an assassination. No. Look, you're a law enforcement officer. As a law enforcement officer, you're there to serve and protect, not to assassinate. And I don't think that's the case here. I mean, in all the things that I've been involved in throughout the years, I don't use that term when there's this kind of a situation that occurred. It was an officer chasing someone who had a gun, and he asked or told the person to drop the gun, and the person made a turn towards him with a gun. And I think we can see that. I can see it. But he didn't toss a gun based upon what I saw and what other people will see. That's unfortunate that this decision was made to have a gun, first of all, but number two, to get into a chase with an officer who used fatal force.
All right, I appreciate both of you very much. Thank you very much.
Never have, never will. Because those who build the future on...
Right now it's spring.
Full-time and part-time positions. If you're worried you missed it, the event actually goes until 7 tonight. Just bring your resume and be ready for on-the-spot interviews. Phil is back with the last look at your forecast after this. As we go to break, a reminder you can get your late evening news 1 hour. They're losing. The Taliban now control or contest more territory across Afghanistan than at any other point in the last 20 years. And in recent months, they've closed in around major capital cities. So I wonder, without U.S. help, without coalition support, can you hold them at bay?
And it has been the Afghan forces that have been at the forefront of this fight against terrorism. Of course, the U.S. support and our NATO allies support has been critical to this fight. But we would continue to do what it takes to defend ourselves and our nation.
And that's right. Let me ask you, though, because the Taliban say they will not negotiate with you. So how do you get them to the table, especially once the U.S. is gone?
We have been very disappointed by their reaction that is obviously not constructive at all towards finding a peaceful settlement to this conflict. One of the commitment that we have been hearing, both from United States and our international allies, have been their diplomatic support, and we are hoping that diplomatic support will be channeled in a way, both from their sides and to our regional partners, that would compel Taliban to come to the table and negotiate.
Can I ask you about the way that the peace talks have unfolded so far? Because the U.S. largely went around President Ghani. They seem to see him as an impediment or an obstacle to that process. Do you think that the U.S. treated President Ghani fairly in this?
The partnership between U.S. and Afghanistan has been always a foundational one. It has been a respectful one. And in terms of your comment regarding President Ghani, I have to tell you that President Ghani has been the one who has demonstrated the most commitment towards peace. It has been his platform of election. And at the same time, he has taken very difficult and risky steps in order to move forward towards a peace process. The United States, yes, stepped in to facilitate the peace process. The first phase of it was negotiation between the U.S. and the Taliban, but then it also led to an opportunity that the Taliban and the Afghan government could discuss and try to find a solution together.
Ambassador.
Review since the siege. Tomorrow on a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
When I grow up, I want to be a doctor. I would help.
Once again, the great...
their alleged need and their alleged fear to use force based off of an alleged need to kill some type of a threat. And so to see this young man turn with his hands up and to not hear more commands, a singular command, and then to see this officer actually lie on his report, it's not shocking to me. Literally, I'm probably maybe 2 minutes walking from where George Floyd was murdered. I can get out of my house and walk 2 minutes and I'll be right there at George Floyd Square. And and let me just walk back a little bit about what happened on the night that they murdered George Floyd. And so we had began getting, I'm a local organizer, been organizing for several years here in the Twin Cities, and we had began getting calls from a mother whose son was murdered by the police. She had begun hearing that there was a man who was murdered by the Minneapolis police, and that it supposedly happened really close to where I live. I had heard nothing about that, so I left my house and I went and I began talking to people who was locally there. The people locally there began telling me that, yes, the police actually killed a man, that they put, I was told at the time, their foot on someone's neck. I then began questioning some of the officers. I even called the chief, and then the chief and others said that there was a medical emergency that led to that led to George Floyd's death. And that was the reports, the official reports that was coming from the police department. But that was totally and wholly different than the reports that I had began getting from people who was actually on the scene itself. And so right here in the instant situation, we see the same exact situation in which we have these reports that were given out by police officers that now with our own eyes, we see are fundamentally different than the facts.
Yeah, and that is the problem, and that is why it's so important for us on this end of the desk here, as far as journalists. We can't just take these reports as fact. There is what someone says and what they claim. These are claims. They are not statements of fact. And when they're coming from police, you just can't assume that they're factual, because we then get the video and it turns out it ain't quite true. Ralph Godby, it's always great talking with you. And Eliza Darris, thank you very much. Welcome to the Readout family, and thank you for being here, and we'll have you back. Still ahead.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. The Biden administration is slapping new sanctions on Russia over its cyber attacks and election interference. Plus, new information disclosed in those sanctions allows us to connect some very important collusion-related dots about the Trump campaign. We'll be right back.
Small apartment, and his cigarette caused
the carbon monoxide content could have been at a maximum.
Yes, it does. It tells us that if the hemoglobin is saturated at 98%, it tells you all there was for everything else is 2%, and so the maximum amount of carbon monoxide would be 2%.
And what's interesting about that exchange, Aaron, is that we were actually a few words away from a mistrial in this, even after coming all this way, because there is a separate report about a blood gas level report that the defense didn't know about. It was only disclosed to them at the last minute, last night. Their expert witness had already left town, and the judge was very angry about it today, saying that if that witness brought up that new blood gas report at all over the course of questioning today, he would have declared a mistrial. So the questioning was very precise. That did not happen. And now, of course, we look ahead to closing statements set for Monday. And then, of course, that moment, the preparation of the moment of a verdict that will come later after that in the run-up to what has been, again, a very, very tense time here in the Minneapolis area for almost a year now.
All right, Omar, thank you very much. I want to go now to Tony Romanucci, attorney for the Floyd family and also for the family of Daunte Wright. So, Tony, Omar laying out the drama that went on in court today. Prosecutors said they got new evidence from the medical examiner last night showing Floyd's carbon monoxide levels were normal. The judge refused to share this new evidence with the jury. Prosecutors, they say, knew this theory was going to come up when the trial began. And they didn't bring it up last week when the medical examiner testified. So, obviously, Omar talked about how close this was for a mistrial, but does it concern you that the prosecution missed something like this that could raise doubt?
I really don't think the prosecution missed something. They may have missed an opportunity, but I don't think that they missed anything that the jury hasn't captured. Really, what the defense has been trying to do this whole case is really negate the obvious. The default story here remains the video, common sense, kneeling for 9 minutes on someone's neck. So this issue about the carbon monoxide, I really think is a sideshow, Aaron. And with the testimony today of 98% saturation on the hemoglobin, with only the possibility of 2% carbon monoxide, I think they closed the door on that issue.
So we also heard today, Tony, from Derek Chauvin for the first time speaking in court today. He declined to testify in his defense. Here's that moment.
I have advised you, and we have gone back and forth on the matter, would be kind of an understatement, right?
Yes, it is.
And have you made a decision today whether you intend to testify or whether you intend to invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege?
I will invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege today.
Tony, interesting that they had gone back and forth, and it sounded like Derek Chauvin wanted to tell his side of the story, but it's to me, it sounded like he acquiesced to his attorney's thoughts that it was not a good thing to do. Would you have liked to see him take the stand?
Well, I think we have to play two sides of the coin here. Would I have loved to have heard what he said? Yes. Should he have taken the stand? I think any attorney would have told him, do not take the stand, because I would have been licking my chops at that cross-examination. I would have kept him on that stand for hours going through that video, second by second, asking him, did you relieve the pressure off of his neck at this moment? What about the next moment? Did you hear him say that he couldn't breathe? So it was way too much risk to put him on the stand.
So tonight we're now bracing for a fifth night of protests in Minneapolis. The Chauvin trial, of course, colliding now with the death of Daunte Wright. And obviously you are representing the Wright family as well. Razor wire has been installed around all 5 police precincts in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And it's not just there. The D.C. Police Department has mobilized officers starting Monday, taking away time off. New York, Atlanta, Chicago, also preparing. What is the Floyd family's message to anybody who wants to go to the street and protest? And really I say this, no matter what the verdict is.
Well, first of all, I mean, the Floyd family is not stopping anybody from protesting. Yeah. They do want peaceful protesting. They've said once, they've said it forever, justice for George is justice for all. And so now we have to worry about justice for Daunte Wright, justice for Adam Toledo. I'm in Chicago. We have to brace for that tonight. Hopefully it'll be peaceful here too. You know, we're talking of this nation is only talking about policing. We need to look at this concept. We need to look at this issue and really get serious about reform. But in the meantime, it is totally permissible to be out in those streets exercising your First Amendment rights and freedom of speech.
All right. I appreciate your time, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
That is 574 fewer than what was filed in the previous report. Meanwhile, across the country, the number of Americans applying for unemployment benefits dropped sharply last week. The latest report indicates the labor market is starting to heat up as governments lift restrictions on businesses. 576,000 people filed for unemployment benefits last week. That's the lowest number since the pandemic began. The decrease in claims is further proof that the labor market is continuing to improve as more Americans are getting vaccinated and businesses are filling positions left empty during the shutdown and the economic slowdown.
After a flood wiped out Lake Hiddenwood State Park in 2018, many local and state officials wondered if it would ever be a possibility to get that park back up and running again. Now, almost exactly 3 years later, the Lake Hiddenwood Foundation is a few months away from pulling off the unthinkable. SIOUX walks us through that process from Selby, South Dakota.
In May of 2018, Lake Hiddenwood State Park lost its dam and by extension became defunct. Now the local community is working.
You're trying to take over Ukraine any day now, and here we are learning that some of the things he has spoken out about weren't even true.
Yeah, so the question is why? Because, you know, I would say, you know, this is convenient to say all of a sudden when the guy's out of office that, oh, actually we kind of messed up on the intel. This is not true. I mean, they were literally going on air every single day talking about this story and said that the president doesn't care. By the way, the military supported the past president. So what was their motivation?
Well, the military definitely supported President Trump, but the intelligence community was at odds with President Trump from before day one.
Of course.
And when you're building a narrative to impeach a president, when you're building a narrative to sow division and to delegitimize a legitimate election, every little bit counts. Every little yard in a football game gets you to 100 yards and a touchdown, right? And so every story they could fathom, conjure, create, manipulate put out on the headlines and then do their media tour to pretend to be outraged. Meanwhile, U.S. troops were actually in combat and dying because of politicians' bad decisions. But every bit of it they could pin on Trump, true or not, was useful. And Joe Biden's president now, so maybe it was effective. And how many stories used against President Trump were turned into something that wasn't true? Many of them. And President Trump gave you plenty of reasons not to like him. He just happened to make some good decisions along the way, and they couldn't let that happen either.
Maybe if they spent more time focusing on the intel, the actual intel, and not the woke culture in the military, then maybe they would get some stuff done. All right, but anyway, we'll talk about it. Thanks, brother.
Take care, Governor.
Now, we were told this week that the number of child migrants held in the Border Patrol's facilities are going down. That's great news. We celebrated. But nobody asked where they were going. We just found out, and we'll discuss it next.
Look at...
I couldn't even get it out of the car.
She captured her anguish in this video.
I'm in so much pain.
She's now a COVID long hauler, takes 20 different pills a day, and sees a neurologist, a cardiologist, and a pulmonologist.
I have an appointment next Thursday.
While she has to live with this chronic condition, because she lives in Canada with its taxpayer-funded universal healthcare system, at least she doesn't have to worry about getting good care or affording it.
That's all part of our universal health care. So I'm not paying any of those bills.
But does a universal system help more broadly when a pandemic breaks out?
Welcome back.
Dr. Danielle Martin is a family doctor and executive vice president at Women's College Hospital in Toronto.
The first and most obvious success of the Canadian healthcare systems in response to the COVID-19 pandemic is that if anyone has symptoms of COVID-19, they've been able to access testing free of charge, and heaven forbid if you require an ICU stay, if you need to be intubated and ventilated, all of those things are covered under the public system.
Martin notes that Canada has lost many thousands of people to COVID and has struggled in parts with its response.
This is one of the things about COVID-19. It's exposed in every country, the places where you've built something strong from the foundations up, and it's also exposed the places where you're running around trying to patch things on in order to make it work.
Canada is a single-payer system, though here, each of the 13 provinces and territories control their own system. Doctor and hospital care is covered, but major gaps do exist. One example, most medications outside the hospital aren't covered, but supplemental insurance, which most people get through their work, picks up the slack. During the pandemic, Canada has had much better outcomes than the U.S. Its overall death rate is about 3 times lower than America's.
So we have built quite an effective system within Ontario to respond to COVID-19.
Dr. Kieran Moore is the head of public health for Kingston and the surrounding region in southern Ontario. This holiday destination could have easily become a COVID hotspot, but this area of roughly 200,000 people has had only 2 deaths during the whole pandemic.
That's the benefit of having a universal healthcare system, because all partners are working together. There's not a private-public separation of responsibility.
Well, that's in her period of acquisition, and you said that was a week and a half.
Once a positive case is identified, nurses spring into action.
Our records indicate that you were exposed on February 14th.
With daily calls, they make sure people are safe, staying home, and not spreading the virus.
All right, so you haven't traveled outside of the province in the last 14 days?
Public health departments can levy serious penalties if you don't.
You can be subject to a fine of $5,000 per day.
I had only seen what was on the news and it was all bad, so I was assuming the worst.
For a patient like Amanda Antwine, who tested positive last year, she got the kind of follow-up care that's often lacking in the U.S.
I got a call from the public health nurse every day, and if I was having a bad day, it was a couple of times. Any questions that I had, she would find out and get right back to me.
Canada's system has also largely avoided what we saw in certain parts of America, hospitals being overrun and straining to care for a surge of COVID patients.
We haven't experienced anything like colleagues in places like New York City have experienced or elsewhere in the world where they were hit the hardest.
Dr. Hannah Wunsch works in critical care medicine at Sunnybrook Health Sciences in Toronto. Because hospitals here operate within a coordinated system,
It's been really busy up here.
an oversight board like this one can shift patients from stressed facilities to those with extra capacity.
We have over 50 patients in the hospital, 15 in the unit, 14 ventilated.
That often didn't happen in places like New York during the early days of the pandemic.
Baseline, U.S. hospitals and health networks are very much competing against each other. And so while many of them have learned to function together over time out of necessity, it's not baked into the system, it's not inherent to the way they function in normal times.
But Canada's experience also shows the gaps that can occur when a country achieves universal care but stops there. Canada has seen many of the same problems we've seen in the U.S. with our fragmented system. The vast majority of Canada's COVID-19 deaths, roughly 70%, have occurred in long-term care facilities, most of which aren't a part of the public system. The toll has also been particularly hard on marginalized communities.
Really, to me, what COVID has exposed is that the pre-existing condition has been chronic neglect.
Dr. Andrew Buzari teaches public health and also works at a clinic serving people experiencing homelessness.
We can't say that we have a perfect system. We can't say that we have when we think about our shortcomings on drug coverage, on access to mental health and supports, to the social supports taking place. You really can't say that we've completely figured this out. And really, when you think about the brunt of who's had to be punished by our failure to do so, it's been marginalized communities, racialized populations, and really people living in poverty.
Have you been in contact with anyone with those symptoms? No.
And then there's the issue of vaccines. If there is anyone in Canada who should be near the top of the list for vaccination, it's 80-year-old breast cancer patient Ruth Ann Warren. Her cancer care, she says, has been superb.
Out of this world, fantastic. I have been so blessed.
But she, like millions of other older, medically vulnerable Canadians, was still waiting to get a vaccine in late February when we visited. A complicated negotiation with vaccine manufacturers and a failure to invest in its own drug production and delivery put Canada far behind the U.S. And today, only 2% of Canada's population has been fully vaccinated, compared to roughly 22% of Americans.
There's your guy.
That's my doctor.
But Warren's son, Cece, who's a professor in the U.S., is glad his mother lives in Canada.
With the death rates in the States compared to what we've had here, I guess I'd rather be waiting for a vaccine than have, 3 times the per capita deaths. That's what we can sort of look at.
Whoa.
Ruth Ann was confident the vaccine issues would be smoothed out soon. She told us how angry it makes her when she hears politicians in the U.S. demonize her nation's healthcare system.
Why wouldn't it make me angry? I have this ability to go to a doctor when I need it, and not just me, but my next door neighbor who's working at McDonald's at a low income wage. Why is the system down in the States so adamant against it? I can't understand that. I just can't understand it.
We share a common border, but have 2 very different outlooks. And as yet another spike of infections hit both countries, with new variants spreading quickly, several Canadian provinces have imposed new restrictions, while in America, it's largely full steam ahead to reopen. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham.
Are fold up.
Both planes that our members were on, there was several families, at least 5 or 6 families on each plane, all in the.
So, Senator, I don't have the context for the list that you just
Have you described them as racist in the past?
I generally use the term discrimination. I'm a lawyer. I follow the facts.
Was Officer Darren Wilson justified or not in the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014?
As a private citizen, there is something that feels unfair. And
the Department of Justice issued an 87-page report. That's not grand jury sensitive information. That's not secret. It's an 87-page report released by Benita Gupta when she ran the office that you aspire to lead. It concluded that the shooting was justified.
All right. Well,
you obviously do not want to take the position that the shooting was justified, despite what Eric Holder and Benita Gupta have said, given the fact that you won't answer the simple question, yes or no.
Well, that guy, Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, seems to thrive on the politics of vindictiveness. In 2014, Cotton reportedly put a hold on the nomination of Cassandra Butts to be the ambassador to the Bahamas. She died of leukemia while waiting for Cotton to lift that hold on that black woman. I would also like to point out that hours after Clark's hearing yesterday, Cotton joined Senators Hawley and Cruz, fellow members of the committee, in voting against a bipartisan bill on anti-Asian hate crimes. So, my friends, today's ignominious award for the absolute worst goes to the Republican men of the Senate Judiciary Committee who managed to simultaneously mansplain and whitesplain at this accomplished woman. But wait, there's more. There's one person who brought the stupid in such a spectacular way that we had to set him aside for special scrutiny, and that is next.
All right, Matthew Dow, thank you very much, as always, for your perspective. And next, President Biden slams Russia with new sanctions as his administration presents new evidence of what the Russian intel got from the Trump campaign. And Capitol Police Officer William Evans, killed in the line of duty, buried today next to his father in his hometown.
Conversations